anyone who looks at that small of a window, they are day trading with property. They're not really investing into property, okay? While you would see significant amount of growth, but you should always have a medium-term view towards the property anyway, okay? This is where the strategy comes into place. Typically, what you could do is you could basically use one of those properties which has grown by 30 or 35%. You can extract the equity out, or you can even sell and basically use that money and use one of those renovation strategies that we talked about in season 1, where you buy a poor house in the best street, use the renovation and the manufactured equity to basically step into the game, keeping your LVRs down. Yes, you would pay a bit more premium, but on a net wealth side of things, you are still better off, right? Hello and welcome to Help Me Buy Property podcast, powered by Investor Partner Group, the amazing property investment group. This is the episode number 2 of why it is the most dumbest idea or the silliest idea to buy a property to live in. And we have been diving headfirst into the surging house prices in episode 1. The episode 2 is all about not only unpacking what are the reasons that are going to drive the market or the real estate market in 2024, but we are also going to talk about portfolio diversifications. We are going to basically talk about what is the better way to get into the Australian real estate market. Now, there are different genres when you talk about property investment or entering into the real estate market. But for people who have been listening to us or me from day dot, they understand that buying an asset or buying a house to live in is not an asset. It is a liability. So even if it grows up in value, you are still stuck. Stick right till the very end, because when we are going to unpack all of this is going to be a big reveal. Thank you for listening to us today. Take care, stay safe, and I'm going to see you on the inside. Just to quote numbers for people, average house prices by 2027, Melbourne sits at about 1.3 million. Current median sits at about $915,000. Sydney house prices, current median sits at 1.3 million, is going to hit almost $2 million. And this is like in the next 3 years. So we're talking about 30% increase. So what happens next? I think that's where the gist of the conversation also is. And so we were talking about this. There's a massive disparity between brand new houses and established properties right now. And a lot of owner-occupiers don't know about this. Like even me as a full-scale developer, you don't comprehend how much the prices have gone up from an owner-occupier perspective, because in development space, everything is about profit. And so you don't really care how much the price have gone up if the ultimate price of the stock has gone up. And so you look at the profit and you still make the call. As an owner-occupier, just to provide a bit more context to people, I know a friend of mine who was building a house for 45 squares, and this house typically would have costed about $650,000 to build. Today, easily at around $850 to almost $1 million. And so massive, right? You're talking about 30-35% increase in just the build cost. So yeah, how do you respond to that? Like, what are the things that you would think would happen to the market? When you talk about inflation, right? Everything is going up. Of course, the inflation impacts the houses a lot more. And so this is inflation we're talking about, right? So the build price have gone up, the construction price have gone up, ultimately the final price have gone up. The owner-occupier who are holding on to the established properties haven't realized that the inflation is playing its part. And then all of a sudden, almost overnight, that realization happens. And the owners who are sitting on the established properties basically switch and flip and start charging more because the buyer's interest in established properties is a lot more. What interesting dynamics at play.
Yeah. And what does that mean then in terms of, I guess, people that are looking to purchase as well, considering, are they better off, are they better off buying established properties? Are they better off buying brand new properties as well, if you're going to go down that path?
Look, majority of the times what I've seen is that the discrepancy between established property and a brand new property sits somewhere between 15 to 20%, nothing more than that. Same, I'm talking about 10 years sort of price difference, age difference, right? So that's where the disparity sits. You're talking about almost 30% discrepancy, maybe sometimes even 35% discrepancy in prices. And based on that data in itself, I know for a fact that the established property prices have to go up by at least 15%, right? Because as an owner-occupier, if you go out in the market today and you put your hand up and say, okay, I have 20% deposit, what should I buy? The value is in buying established property because, of course, you're getting a bargain compared to a brand new property, right? But the more owner-occupiers come in and start doing it, and this is market basically coming into equilibrium, right? The buildings cannot stop. The building needs to happen because an average house change in an owner-occupier space and established property is somewhere around 8 to 10 years. A house naturally sells between 8 to 10 years once, right? Basically, that's the average. So there is not enough established property stock out there from the population, from the demand side as well. And so people need to build. There is no questions about it. But because the demand is higher than supply, what would happen is as soon as people start entering into this space and they make the same call as what we are making, but established properties makes a lot more sense, you would see that the price would start jumping till it basically balances out to that 15-20% price, this difference, this disparity, and then people start building again. And that's what I'm looking at over the next sort of 2 to 3 years.
Yeah. And so what does that mean again for people that are looking to buy like, I want to buy my first home. What does that mean, Mox? What is the consideration for me? Does that mean that actually if I buy something old or new or whichever, like am I going to be sitting on it? I can't access anything. I want to be able to retire when I'm 10, 20, 30 years. What are the considerations for me? Because I guess just stepping back, we are so used to and we're so conditioned to feel that we need the security and the safety of our own principal place of residence. And this is what we're marketed, right? We're marketed from the banks, get your first home, get your dream home and everything else. We're not taught the other way around to be able to go, let's build, potentially, let's look at where you want to go and where you want to be. Because we look at things fairly short term. We're like, what about my first home? And it's going to be comfortable. It's going to be wonderful. But we don't necessarily, we haven't been taught to really think about how this asset is actually going to contribute to our long-term, retirement.
Definitely.
It doesn't have to be retirement, but we'll just call it retirement planning or long-term financial goals. Because I don't think generally we're taught to really think that far.
Yes.
Yeah, and I guess this is where what we're trying to really sort of highlight here is going, well, have you thought, when you're just about to purchase your next property, have you actually thought about where it sits in terms of your long-term financial strategy?
Correct. When does it need to really happen?
That's right. Like, do you actually know what you're potentially what's the lifestyle you're trying to work towards? What is the life that you're building?
Yeah.
And you ask this question. I ask this question when you ask it when you're talking to investors. I ask it when I talk to business owners. Like, what are you ultimately? Because that's when you sort of work backwards to sort of go, well, what is my next step?
Yes.
And the next step would be purchasing my own property. If I do that, what does that allow me to do, or what does that not allow me to do?
Look, it's a very important consideration, right? So if you think about it from a first-home buyer's perspective, with the way the rents are going up, almost like 20% over the last 2 years, 2 cuts by interest rate is basically going to give the buyers the confidence to come back into the market. That's what I truly feel, right? Which basically means that the question would be, should I buy a place to live in because the rents are so high? Or should I go back and invest and keep renting, right? It's $1 million question. But this Australian dream of people thinking, I can always buy a first home and the first home buying is my birthright.
Yeah.
That is going to disappear. Like, that is not going to be around over the next 10 years. And it's a bold statement that I'm making. And the rationale and the reason behind this statement is the average Australian income still sits at about $80,000 to $100,000, right? And so you multiply that by 6.5, you're looking at, because that's where the numbers are, from a servicing perspective, on average, you're looking at maybe $700,000-$800,000 debt, right? So if the prices are going to be at 1.3, 1.4 million, combining the two incomes, even like husband and wife or the two partners coming in together, you can't get there, unfortunately. And if the parents are not helping and you can't get there, how do you get into this game is the question, right?
Yes.
So, and it's a very important dilemma that's basically playing out right now.
And this is where, again, I go back to the question, but Moss, isn't that good if I buy my own place? I'm going to have a ton of equity and it's going to be amazing, right? So I guess to a certain extent, yes, and also no. I'm going to talk about the no part because I think then I'll let you do the yes bit. The no part is, as we highlighted, wage growth isn't quite there.
Yes.
And so even if you've got the equity in place, and depending on how maxed out you are in your serviceability, you may not even be able to access that equity
Yes.
until you've got that serviceability, or until you've got a very creative broker, or, if you're earning business, you've got business or other portfolio of properties and investments, then potentially you can access that. But I guess that's where what we're trying to say here is if you don't have any other income apart from your job and you're looking to purchase your first property, it's like just working out whether that's your first home or it's going to be investments. This is the things to be able to consider, because again, equity, serviceability, rates, looking at also long-term going, when you're purchasing your own property, if you're putting 20% down for the deposit, you've got an 80% loan, right? That 80% loan, it's generally not tax deductible.
Yes.
Right? So you can't deduct that. That will be wonderful. You could, but no. So what does that mean? That whole loan itself is not really doing you any particular good apart from you paying more in interest to the bank than the actual property will possibly be worth in 30 years.
100%.
And that's where the reality is that as opposed to an investment property where there are definitely the tax benefits there. And I'm not going to kill party here, but I'd love for you to give your input on that aspect, Moss, in terms of going, well, Moss, if I buy my place, the price is going to go up. I'm going to have a ton of equity. Why are you telling me it's not a good time to buy my property?
Yeah, so ultimately, we are not saying that you don't have to buy a property. The problem is that you don't have to buy a property to live in, right? Basically, that's the notion that we are calling out. So my feedback to people is that if you have only $100,000 available to yourself and you don't have an amazing servicing and you are thinking about entering into the realms of property, do it via rent vesting, because you can catch the real estate growth quite quickly, because that's how fast the market is moving. That hindsight of growth cycle has changed dramatically over the last 5 to 6 years. We are seeing 15% growth in 3 to 5 months rather than 15% growth in 12 to 15 months or 2 years or 3 years, right? That's how fast the market is moving. There is almost 30% growth that is projected out of some of these major cities, right? We talk about Adelaide, Perth, Queensland, even the affordable cities. And so it makes a lot more sense for your deposit to go a long way, right?
Yeah.
Now, even if you have a higher deposit at play, it makes a lot more sense to basically split that deposit and go for a product that is going to basically not only diversify your property portfolio, but also give you an opportunity to scale up and build up sustainable income stream coming back to you. Choosing a property to live in a higher debt environment where you buy $1 million property for $200,000 deposit plus $50,000, say, stamp duty, makes zero sense, because you're not in the wealth creation business now. Understand, for people who have been listening to me from day dot, the house that you live in is not an asset, it's a liability. And so even if it grows up in value, you are stuck. The reason you are stuck is because, one, you don't have any more excess capacity for you to go back into the market because you have just locked in your servicing. And so any equity that you are creating, even though that may be available to you, you can't really use that equity from your perspective. Whereas if you go down the path of rent vesting and do it properly through a right structure, then you would get an opportunity to come back even at a 1.5 million price point to buy a house for yourself at a much more lower LVR, using the benefit of diversification and the growth that you've caught out on, some of these other investment properties.
Why don't we, I think this would be a really good point where we dive further into how that looks and smells like and what the numbers are going to potentially be like. Because I'm sure lots of people are going, but because there's such an emotional attachment to purchasing your own home, but also a bit of fear and uncertainty of like, okay, if I build a portfolio now, when and how do I end up buying my own home? When is the right time to do so? When and what, how, and if, like, what if I missed the boat and then I never end up getting my own property and I'm going to be renting and not being able to put my favorite photos on the wall up ever again. So I think we need to address those emotional needs as well of going, all right, how do we end up getting to that point?
Definitely, 100%. Eventually, with the house price soaring, we can still buy property, but the question now becomes, should you buy a property to live in or should you buy a property to invest? And why do you say that, property to live in does not make sense right now? So one of the things to consider, Cheryl, is that coming back to your original point, when you're talking about people can buy a place to live in right now, and they might scratch and bring in the servicing for say 800 or 900,000 or even to $1 million. A lot of people who don't have that availability of credit, typically they would be looking at off the plan properties or house and land packages, because naturally their thinking is, I need to step into the market and buy something right now. And you see a lot of property spookers out there would be like, oh, just pay 5% deposit and you can get a house in 3 years time, or pay $10,000 and you can get, apartment in the city in 10 years, in 2 years time or 3 years time. And naturally a lot of owner occupiers get attracted to that because they might not have a big deposit in play. They might only have 50, 60,000. And so they're like, oh, I'll save to that, but I'm going to buy an expensive property. I'm going to pledge to an expensive property of $800,000 or $900,000 in as an apartment or a house and land package. And those are the mistakes that we are basically trying to call out, that, you don't need to basically go out there and buy a property to live in right now. You could potentially look at smaller price points and basically go out there and buy a property to invest, so that, all of these factors, when they turn around and the market does deliver 20 to 30% growth, then you are not at the losing end. You're not saying, oh, I've missed out on it again, like what happened during COVID.
Yeah. I think one point as well, because you're talking about the price of properties, a lot of people are finding that they just can't afford to live where they actually want to live because the prices are so high. And so when you sort of go, well, if you're then going, well, if you rent in a particular area, particularly areas that are a little bit more in the premium space, the rental yields are a lot less for those properties, right? So you're finding that it actually makes more sense to rent a property that is more expensive than it is to actually purchase the property itself. And I've seen where a property was probably about I reckon it was probably about $6-7 million. Right? It's oceanfront and all of that, but it was renting for $2,000 a week, which looks like about $2,000 is a lot of money. But if you were to purchase that house and got a loan for that, and that's a lot of zeros behind that what you'd be paying in a mortgage would be far
100%
more than what you would rent it for. You sort of look at that, and I'm not a broker, but I know from at least in terms of our own experience, if you're purchasing an investment property, you actually have higher serviceability than if you did not.
Definitely.
I guess the same amount of deposit that you had for a property, you would be able to borrow more. And so there's so many benefits there from being able to go, well, one potentially allows you to actually probably rent where you want to live, and then be able to invest in areas which you might not necessarily want to live. Because I guess that it's something to take into account of, right? To be able to go, well, let's do some numbers before you look at purchasing in a particular area. Does it actually make sense for you to rent in that area, which possibly means that you've got an extra bit of money that you can then put into investment properties or whatever.
100%. 100%.
But I guess, okay, here's my devil's advocate question. I had one up my sleeve anyhow. When do I actually get a chance to purchase my own property? Fantastic. I buy all these investments. They're wonderful, and I buy the right types of investments. All right. And we've had other episodes where we talked about this, and then they probably give me some income. They go up in equity. But then so does the price of the property in the area that I ultimately want to live in. Will I get priced out of buying in that market?
Amazing question.
Thank you.
I think it's a valid question. for a lot of people, right? Naturally, people default back to thinking that, okay, if I buy $1 million property, if the market is going to grow by 15% across the board, then of course my property at the $1 million would grow by 150. So even if I buy 2 properties at 500, they should give me the same amount of return, right? So technically, I'm not worse off or better off, right? And so let me break this down into a few things. So number one, and we've talked about this before, that as you mentioned, as an investor, if you're buying, your servicing is a lot more than you buying a place to live in. Okay. So you get an opportunity to pick a better product in the first place. Okay. That's very, very important. That's number one. Number two, if you're structuring your portfolio correctly, then you should not be locking in the servicing to basically come back and buy a property to live in. Even you're going out there and buying a property to invest from a rental perspective. Okay. But that's not where the gist of the conversation is. The conversation is that understand that when the rate cuts are happening, they don't cut, 1% every month. They cut slowly and gradually, okay? I was talking to Chris, the mortgage broker, who was here last time, and he said with every 0.25% rate cuts, I think you get like 2.5% of your servicing back. That's like peanuts, like that's nothing. Like you think about it really like logically, right? That even if the rate cut happens at 0.25% and then 0.5%, at a $500,000 loan, you're getting like $25,000 back, like the servicing back. That's nothing, right? So the market comes back way faster than this, okay? The interesting bit based on the data that we have seen is this, that the lower price points are the one where the exponential growth happens, and the higher price points are the ones where, because people are not actively, stepping in, or they're not going crazy, you don't see exponential growth. You still see mature growth coming through some of those pockets, but you don't see exponential growth coming through some of these areas, okay? So you would see a $500,000 or $600,000 property, growing by 25, 30, 35%, quite fast. And people would relate to this if they follow property market quite closely. I was just looking at a property this morning where it was sold in 2019 for $260,000, and right now they were asking about, I think, $820,000. That's what happens to affordable markets, right?
Yes.
Whereas if you talk about, $600,000 property or $800,000 property that was purchased that time, you are still sitting at, about, maybe $1 million or just below $1 million mark right now. And so that's where the difference is. That's where the magic really happens, where you might buy a property for yourself, yes, at a bigger price point, but the way the average rules of growth works on affordable prices versus a premium price is quite different. And that's where you would get the best bang for the buck investing right now than buying a place to live in. So how do you come back is the question.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, exactly.
So think about it. If you buy, say, 2 properties or 3 properties with the same amount of deposit, using LMI, being a lot more aggressive, you have servicing on hand, say, at $1.2 million, and you go out and buy 3 properties at $300,000, right? Or $400,000 at 3 properties. What you have now done is you've diversified your property portfolio, okay? What you have done is you're basically aiming for that 30-35% average growth over the 3 properties over the next sort of 3 to 4 years. I never look at really short term. I'm not talking about 6 months, because anyone who looks at that small of a window, they are day trading with property. They're not really investing into property, okay? While you would see significant amount of growth, but you should always have a medium-term view towards the property anyway, okay? This is where, the strategy comes into place. Typically, what you could do is, you could basically use one of those properties which has grown by 30 or 35%. You can extract the equity out, or you can even sell and basically use that money and use one of those renovation strategies that we talked about in season 1, where you buy a poor house in the best street, use the renovation and the manufactured equity to basically step into the game, keeping your LVRs down. Yes, you would pay a bit more premium, but on a net wealth side of things, you are still better off, right? Where people don't understand or they fail to understand is, okay, if I bought $1 million property and it's sitting at 1.2, they think that they have done really well because they're like, I've made $200,000, right?
Yes.
But understand, if you've bought 3 properties with the same $1 million debt, right? The total value of the property portfolio could sit well above 1.5, 1.6 million, right? And if you sell and then come back and use a portion of that money to come back and even buy a property at 1.2 million, the net impact is still you're better off, right?
Yeah.
And that's where the magic happens. That's where the real generational wealth is really created. When we discuss strategies with people, that is one of the questions that we always answer for people as to, okay, what is the optimum time when you come back? I've done this with my property portfolio as well, right? You've talked about this where, we've basically gone in and bought a property at the right time, with the right strategy in place.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I was very conflicted when we were basically putting up this topic today, because when you were first talking about the interest rate cuts, I made a comment that the best time to improve your lifestyle is in the down market. It's the best time to improve your lifestyle. It's in the down market because you can buy really, really cheap. You can basically choose and negotiate and do a lot. The problem is that down market is almost about to end. And so you have missed that cycle of making a conscious choice of moving in and buying a property for yourself.
Yeah.
And so the tables have turned and the market is about to change.
Yeah. I think what you're also, just to reiterate a bit and add to what you're saying there, is that even though the prices are going to go up in terms of where you're ultimately wanting to buy, like if you sort of look at it from a long-term perspective, like if you were to purchase that property with a loan, like I mentioned before, that interest rate, the interest that you pay on that is not going to be tax deductible. So yes, in terms of the initial, potentially if you're selling properties down and so on, yes, there's going to be CGT and so on and so forth. However, you're going to be saving so much in terms of that non-tax deductible debt that you would have otherwise had to pay. So
of course,
it's, if you've got a long-term plan, you've got to be able to say, well, within the next 5 to 10 years or whatever that might be, yes, you might have to model out what your numbers are going to be, but the whole point is to be able to go, well, if I'm eventually going to buy a $3 million house, whatever, and it's going to be here and things like that, is going, well, how do I need to model my portfolio to be able to get to that point? And what would that look like if I sell down these properties, CGT, everything else? Because then it means as well that you've just got to be able to have that strategy and that plan in place. And if you're unsure of how to do that, then that's where, you might look at speaking to your advisor in some way or form. So,
100%.
It does require a bit more effort. It does require a bit more planning. And I said, this is why it's not as sexy and as marketable as buy your first home and buy your forever, your dream home and live in it for 30 years, because it's not an easy concept to explain to the general public.
I think as a novice, as a first-time investor or a person who's buying the first property, of course, there is an emotional attachment to living in the property and, calling it a home, right? So I can totally understand people on the other side and on the other fence. I was having a conversation with the client today where they were super emotional, even with their first investment property. And I'm not going to call names, but, they'll listen and they'll understand who I'm talking about. And they were asking us, what's the room size and can you measure the width and the height and the length of the rooms, so that we can get a bit of a feel about how the room sizes are. And, when they send the walkthrough videos to them, they were basically being a bit more pedantic about, hey, can they walk through the corners of the room so that we can get a bit of a feel of how big or small the rooms are?
Right, yeah.
And I can understand the attachment, right? Because, they are emotional investors. They see themselves living there. But as an investor, it's all about the numbers. It's all about how do you create that wealth to find the house and build the house of your dream, or, ultimately get into the ladder of, building not just financial wealth through property, but also creating a lifestyle where you can enjoy a space to live in, etc. All of those things.
Yeah. And the final point, I guess, for me is just to be able to, this sort of strategy, obviously it doesn't work for everyone. And I can say so from just personal experience as well. Like, there are going to be instances where you need to purchase your own home.
Of course.
Where for whatever reason it needs to be, designed to suit particular family arrangements and sort of that. So don't think that you're, in making that choice, it's going to be the end of the world or whatever that might be.
Of course.
It's more about reminding everyone that it's to have when you're purchasing your property, have a plan in mind, understand, really, really get clear on what the numbers is. And I say this more from even, I look at property and as a business. Like building your property portfolio is like a business. You need to know what your numbers are. You need to know what ultimately you're trying to work towards, because otherwise, if you don't have a clear target as to what you're working towards, you're just going to be sort of flip-flopping around going, oh yeah, I sort of think I want to do this, stuff like that. And if you've got millions of dollars to spend and endless serviceability, then do that. That's absolutely fine. For the most part, the most everyday Australians, being able to purchase strategically and being clear on next steps is something that I think we just need to be mindful of, and just be able to have, hopefully the things that we've brought up, it more triggers you to think about your next steps more purposefully and with more strategy in place, and just ask the questions, like challenge your broker, challenge your advisor, even challenge yourselves as to the norms, because what we're doing normally, most Australians can only afford to buy one property.
Definitely. And I think those are definitely golden words. I think a lot of people who are thinking about buying, there would be various reasons for you to buy a property to live in, and there is nothing wrong with that. Ultimately, the idea is to step into the market. What I always say to people is that if that is the decision that you're going to make, don't just make a lifestyle decision, right? Try to bring some of the indicators from an investment side of things into that purchase, right? What a lot of people do is they make a complete lifestyle decision when they're buying their first property. And I think that is going to be such a financial suicide when you're going to think about building generational wealth. You go out and buy an apartment, or you go out and buy an off-the-plan property that does not serve any investment purposes. Think of the ultimate seller, even if you are buying a property for yourself, even if you're buying the property to live in, and make some lifestyle sacrifices for, okay, I'm going to stay away a bit from the school, or I'm going to stay away from a bit of work, in order to basically, go that extra mile in making sure that you're creating that financial wealth for yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Now that's been really cool to go through, Moss. I think it's going to be leaving a lot of our listeners a lot of things to think about and consider. We'd love to hear from our listeners as well, the experiences that they've had in making those sorts of decisions. It's share, ask the questions, share your experiences. How, if you've gone down the path of rent vesting and then purchasing your dream property, please share that with us. We'd love to hear how you went about doing that as well.
Definitely.
So that's really great to hear.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the listeners and users. Stay kind, keep investing, keep smiling. This is Cheryl and Moss checking out. Adios.
Take care. Bye-bye.